and welcome to my second lecture on Vaibhāṣika and the Sautrāntika schools of Buddhism. In this lecture, we will try to understand the epistemology of the Vaibhāṣikas and the Sautrāntikas. When I say epistemology, I want to stick myself only with the theory of perception. So before going into it, let us first understand what is a cognizer or who is a cognizer or an experiencer. Is it the self? No, it cannot be. Although it is convenient to posit the designation of self to the aggregates or dharmas which constitute a person. But Buddhism rejects the notion of a transcendental subject. Okay, if there is no continuous self, how we meaningfully make statements like, I remember seeing this place 3 years ago. How do we explain memory? Now let us understand the Buddhist response. It is true that the self is just a designation given to the causal series of dharmas. But this cause-effect relation that holds between events in one mental stream does the trick. The cognizer or the experiencer is just a designator for a causal series of dharmas. From the cognition that sees, a distinct memory cognition arises, which remains in the seed form and on an appropriate occasion reappears. Now coming back to epistemology and the theory of perception. Here you will know how the two schools differ in this area. While the Vaibhāṣikas believe in Bahya Pratyaksha Vada, which the modern scholars call direct realism. This is because the Vaibhāṣikas claim that external objects are directly perceived. Now the Sautrāntikas believe in Bahya Anumeya Vad, which means external objects are not directly perceived, but they are indirectly inferred. This view the modern scholars call representationalism. At this point, it is important to understand the meaning of a few expressions, because I will be using these expressions while explaining the two theories, and they are intentional object and external object. Now, intentional object or alambana is that what one is directly aware of when one has sensory experience. An external object or artha is a physical object that exists outside the mind. You must also know what representation is and what representationalism stands for. Now, representation means a mental image that is caused by contact between a sense faculty and an external object, and that resembles the external object. Representationalism, on the other hand, is the theory that in sense perception, the intentional object is not an external object but a representation. Now, Vaibhāṣika, as I just stated, are direct realists, which means for them the intentional object is the same as the external object. So what happens here is our sense organs come in contact with the external world and they convey this information to the mind, and one has external sensory perception. And we can see that this is quite in tune with our common sense. But there is more to it, as the Vaibhāṣikas deal with objects not in the ordinary sense of the term, but in the sense of conceptual fictions. And these objects or conceptual fictions are an assortment of numerous atoms and dharmas, such as color, odor, solidity, etc. But these objects definitely exist outside the mind. So for the Vaibhāṣikas, the intentional object of the taste experience is the sweetness, which is one of the several external object dharmas making up the conceptual fiction coffee. Sautrāntikas are advocates of representationalism. This, however, does not mean that they reject the thesis that we become aware of the external object which is outside our mind through our sensory experience. What they suggest is that we are not directly aware of the external object which is outside our mind. Let me again try to clarify this point. Understand the distinction between being directly aware of something and being aware of something indirectly. Now, being directly aware of something stands for something that we directly perceive, whereas being aware of something indirectly stands for something that we infer from our sense perception. Consider this example where we hear the sound of a doorbell, from which we infer that someone is at the door. The Vaibhāṣikas would say that the intentional object which one is directly aware of is the sound of the doorbell. But for them, this sound of the doorbell is an external object existing outside mind. The doorbell will make a sound even if no one is there to hear it. And this is direct realism. According to the Sautrāntikas, we first become aware of the mental image, and from this awareness we infer the existence of an external object. Coming back to the doorbell example, we become aware of the auditory experience and then we infer the existence of the sound. So here we become aware of the sound indirectly. The Sautrāntikas do not deny that the sound of the doorbell exists even if no one hears it. What they say is that if there is no one to hear it, then it is not an intentional object. Interestingly, for the Sautrāntikas, the intentional object of an illusory perception is no different from the intentional object of a veridical perception, because, as you know, the intentional object is what one is directly aware of. And in case of both the illusory perception as well as veridical perception, one is directly aware of the mental image. Then what makes the two cases different? See, in the case of veridical perception, the mental image is just a copy of the external object, whereas in the case of illusory perception, the mental image does not bear resemblance to the external object. So basically, when all goes well, that is when our sense organs work properly and make an exact copy or mental image of the external object which they come in contact with, we have a veridical perception or a true sensory experience. We can understand this whole process of perception with the help of an analogy. When you shoot a video on your mobile phone, you switch on the camera. Then on the screen, you see the images coming. Now understand, the camera is like the sensors, because it is the camera which causes the images to come on the screen. And the images that come on the screen are the intentional objects, because these are what you are directly aware of. But what is the source of the images which come on the screen? the external object or the external world, of course. So, what happens? In perception, the senses produce images in the mind that are copies of what the external object is like. But we sometimes find that our camera doesn't work properly. The lens is not clean, which results in dull or distorted images. So, is the case with the illusory perception. This is what happens in illusion or illusory perception. So, illusory perception occurs when the senses go astray and produce mental images that misrepresent how things are in the external world. Now, why did the Sautrāntikas come up with Bahya Anumeyavad, the theory of representationalism, rejecting the Vaibhāṣika Bahya Pratyakshavad, the theory of direct realism? Further, if we go back to the early Buddhism, there is no reference of Bahya Anumeyavad or the theory of representationalism. So, what convinced the Sautrāntikas to advance this theory? The reason is very interesting, and it comes from the theory of momentariness, and which is probably why Sautrāntikas are said to be the believers of extreme momentariness. Their explanation is that there is always a time gap between the sense organ coming in contact with the external object and having the sense awareness of the object. This is because the moment in which the senses come in contact with the external object does not exist when the sense awareness of it happens. Have a look at the argument in the following slides. It will make clear how the Sautrāntika position leads to representationalism and how the doctrine of momentariness is interwoven in their theory of perception. Please go through the premises attentively. Now, premise 1. The intentional object of perceptual cognition must be A. Capable of being directly present to the cognition that cognizes it, and B. What is responsible for the cognitions having the content it has. Now, let's move to premise 2, which says, in the perceptual process, there is a time lag between the moment of contact between sense faculty and external object and the moment at which there is cognition of what is perceived. Now, premise 3, which says, hence, at the time of perceptual cognition, the external object that the sense faculty came in contact with no longer exists, since all things are momentary. Now, premise 4, which says, the external object with which the sense faculty came in contact is not the intentional object, since it does not now exist like the horns of a hare. Premise 5, and it says, an external object that presently exists is not the intentional object, since it is not responsible for the cognitions having the content it has, like events occurring on the other side of the world. Now, premise 6, and it says, hence, the external object with which the sense faculty comes in contact is not the intentional object. Premise 7, but since in perceptual cognition we are directly aware of something, there must be an intentional object of perceptual cognition. So, we reach the conclusion, therefore, the intentional object of perceptual cognition must be a representation. Let us understand this argument. As you have just seen, that the first premise of the argument makes 2 points. 1. The object must be slam bang present right before us without any intermediary. And 2. The object must serve as an explanation of the content of the cognition. Mind you, we are referring to an intentional object here. Now the second premise states that there is time difference between sense-object contact and the sensory cognition. This is because a cognition takes time to process. It is easy to understand, as you know that the senses send the information to the brain where some processing goes on, and then we have the perceptual cognition. Although this time difference is very less, but it still is. And if you look at the Theravada tradition, you will notice that it takes 17 atomic moments for this process to take place, where one atomic moment is the shortest single duration in which a thing comes into existence and immediately goes out of existence. Anyway, the third premise is the application of the doctrine of momentariness. What meets the eye at moment M1 is not cognized at moment M1 but in moment M2. And what is cognized at moment M2 is not there anymore at moment M2. Let us understand with an example. I have a perceptual cognition of a bright white star in the night sky. But in reality, when I have this cognition of the bright white dharma of the star that met my eyes, it has already passed out of existence. It is true that I still see the bright white star in the sky, but it is not the same which stirred my interest. What I see now is the successor of the dharma I initially came in contact with at moment M1. But it is giving rise to another perceptual cognition for the moment M3. But in no case it can now affect or alter the perceptual cognition that has already taken place at moment M2. It should now be clear what the fourth and the fifth premise assert. The external object now cannot be the intentional object of the perceptual cognition, because the bright white dharma that stirred my visual sense does not exist anymore. So, point 1 of the first premise, that the object must be grasped directly, is not met in the successive cognitions of the external object. Also, the bright white dharma that now exists and is in contact with my visual sense does not fulfill point 2 of the first premise, as it is not in a position to contribute anything to the content of my cognition. Suppose now a cloud hides the bright white star. Can it affect the cognition at M2? No. It in fact becomes the content of the next cognition which I will have in a while from now. So, because of the time lag, no presently existing external object can explain why that is what I cognize. It can have no more to do with what I now see than do events taking place on the other side of the world. The remaining premises 6 and 7 only corroborate to what has already been suggested in the premises from 1 to 5. The only external object that can be the intentional object of my perceptual cognition is the bright white star in the night sky. It is the one with which my visual sense organ came in contact with at moment M1. Neither the external object at moment M2 nor at moment M3 can be the intentional object. No matter how vociferously one announces that I am seeing a bright white star in the night sky now, it will not change anything. So, one thing is clear, external object is not the intentional object. But if there is a perceptual cognition, then one must be directly aware of something. What is it then? It is the indirect awareness, because indirect awareness uses the content of what one was directly aware of. So, in the case where I think this slide will help you in in knowing what is being talked about, and it says, in the sense that if the intentional object of perceptual cognition is not an external object, it must be something internal or mental. It must, in short, be a representation. A representation will take care of both the points outlined in the first premise. One, that the intentional object of perceptual cognition must be capable of being directly present to the cognition that cognizes it, and two, that the intentional object is responsible for the cognition having the content it has. But what is the Vaibhāṣika take on this as they advocate Bahya Pratyakshavad, the theory of direct realism? In the first place, for them, the external object is not different from the intentional object. Going back to our example again, the external object, which is the bright white dharma, is the intentional object of my sensory perception, because they do not take the doctrine of momentariness in a very strict sense. Also, if you remember, for them, the past, the present and the future are real. They exist together, and therefore they would deny the third premise, which says that at the time of perceptual cognition, the external object that the sense faculty came in contact with no longer exists. So for them, the bright white dharma, color dharma, still exists at moment M2 when the cognition of it takes place. It remains obtainable to be directly grasped for the perceptual cognition. Now, the past objects no longer function. That is what makes them past and not present. But existence is something that an entity has timelessly. It can no longer bring about any effects, but it still is. And since it can also explain why the cognition has the content it does, it may be the intentional object. So this is the Vaibhāṣika take on the Sautrāntika position. And this is the difference between the Sautrāntika and the Vaibhāṣika as far as the theory of perception is concerned. And this is where I'll end my lecture. Thank you so much.